And good afternoon. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm excited to welcome you in here to the Dean's Conference Room here on the graduate campus of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. I will welcome you in here for today's discussion, COVID-19 and the calling to public service. I guess probably a best way to start would be to talk about what prompted this webinar. I've only given this talk twice, and both times have been within the last few months. One was down on the campus of Point Loma Nazarene University down in San Diego, just before the crisis became evident, and one afterwards, just a couple weeks ago, to some Pepperdine Seaver College undergraduate students. And it's fair to say that those two talks were taken in very different ways. As I've told some friends, I think the thing that really prompts this discussion is some reflections on my own part about a series of events that changed my own life, and a clearer understanding of a concept called variously calling or vocation, and some events that took place 2 decades ago, specifically with 9/11, but I'm going to talk about a couple other things that happened in my life as well. That caused me to think radically differently about my own career and my own career aspirations, what I thought was important. And as I've seen the increasing number of applications here to the policy school, the increasing number of inquiries that we've received just within the last few weeks, as I've spoken with our graduating students and friends, it's become evident to me that this is one of those times where people are asking the bigger picture questions. And I think that's a good thing. At the same time, it can be nerve-wracking to be forced into asking those questions in ways that you had not previously considered. And so the purpose of this webinar is to talk a little bit about some of my own experiences and things I've learned about the concept of calling, how it's completely changed what I do. I think it's fair to say just at the top, I'm not doing a single thing now that I thought I'd be doing 10 years ago. And I think and I hope that that is at least one indicator of trying to live a life consistent with your calling or vocation. And so the format for this particular webinar is that I'm going to go through a series of slides and talk about some, again, some events that really caused me to think differently about my own career and how that began out of a crisis, again, specifically 9/11. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, turn it over for questions for you. We're obviously using the Zoom platform here, and because of the number of registrations that we received, the easiest way to exchange in Q&A will be to enter questions that you have in the chat feature, which you'll find down at the bottom part of your screen. Just click on the chat icon and type in your questions. You should always feel free to enter a question whenever it strikes you, but please know that I'll look to get to those towards the end of the session. So the way that I've laid out this conversation is to talk a little bit biographically, as I said. I'm going to jump out of a couple of experiences that I've had to talk about some turning points in my own life. And then I'm going to move into some of the various concepts that both secular and religious writers that I've read and have had a big impact on my life, ways that they've described and defined this idea of calling or vocation. And then I want to conclude with a transition to how we might understand calling specifically to public service. That, of course, is my story, right? Leaving a private sector career, which I'll describe, and move into a career in politics, policy, and academia. That's not to say that everyone on this call or on this webinar is thinking about a career in public service. But I do believe there are especially for crises like this one, that have such endemic and significant public policy implications. In other words, we are going to be entering a post-COVID-19 world that in our policy and politics is going to look a lot differently than our pre-COVID-19 world. And I think in that, there is a calling that is going out to people to engage directly in our policy and political worlds that are going to be coming under such radical change and questioning. And so I want to talk about what that could look like. Because while the pandemic is unique in its own way, shape, and form, there are some basic principles about what a calling specifically to public service might look like that I think are important to cover. So I'm going to begin just lay out here my agenda, and I'll share this with you. So again, I'm going to begin a little bit with my personal story and how this understanding of calling changed my life, how it's continued to change my life in the last 20 years. Secondly, talk about how a crisis can form the basis for considering your calling. We don't often like to use the phrase by the former mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, that we shouldn't let a crisis go to waste, but at its best, a crisis is a time when many of the bigger picture questions that we all should be asking ourselves, or at least considering at some point in our lives, become very evident. And I don't think we should lose this opportunity to do that. This is an opportunity. And as we're being called into an era of social distancing and solitude, that there's a real opportunity to deliberate, not just feel lonely, but take a moment of being alone and to use solitude to consider these bigger questions. Talk a little bit about how you can discover your own sense of calling and what a calling, again, specifically to public service looks like. So I want to begin just a brief overview of my early life. You see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, that is what is now New York Presbyterian Hospital in Upper Manhattan. That's where I was born. At the age of 4, my family and I moved to Sydney, Australia. And so lived in Sydney. My dad was in the management consulting business. And so we lived in Sydney for 4 years or just outside of it. Had a significant impact on my life since. I still have family who live in Australia. And one of the aspects of this global pandemic is understanding that even those 10, 15,000 miles away are experiencing some of the same things that we are. My parents divorced when I was 8 years old, and I only raised that for as an issue or a topic that I'll refer back to shortly. We moved back to New Jersey, which is where my mom's family was based, originated. We lived for a year with my grandparents, and then moved with my mom and my brother into a small town in central New Jersey. And that's where I grew up all the way up straight through high school. When I came to college, went to George Washington University for my undergraduate education. And if you know anything about that school, it's really immersed into the city of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, only blocks away from the White House in Foggy Bottom. There's not really a formal campus setting there, but that's really where I began to have a clear understanding of politics and why they were important, and to at least begin to think of if I might myself enter into a career in politics or policy. When I graduated from George Washington University, returned to New Jersey, I didn't really have a sense of what I wanted to do. I was presented with a job opportunity from my uncle, who was in the printing business. And in the first decision point of my own career, decided, frankly, with not a lot of forethought, to enter into what was the family business. My uncle was in the printing business. My grandfather before him was in the printing business. And so we had a long line of printers in our family. And so while I had no essential or inherent attraction to printing, having the desire and the need, frankly, to put food on the table, and seeing an opportunity to work within my family with my uncle, who I loved, I took the job. And as it related to any sort of sense of calling, the only question that I really had was thinking through, as I was entering into sales for my uncle's printing company, that I was a pretty outgoing person. A lot of people say that, you know, I had a decent sense of humor. I was an extrovert, that sales would, almost no matter what kind of sales it was, sales would be a perfect business for me. And so really that was about it. No real consideration of what my other gifts or talents might be, no deeper consideration of where my passions were. Just a set of very kind of pragmatic decisions that I think a lot of us enter into, especially early in our careers, that you've got to get a job, you've got to put food on the table for yourself, and here's an opportunity. And so that's how I got started in the printing business, which transitioned into marketing and advertising over the course of the next 15 years, working in the New York metropolitan area. In many ways, it was a very comfortable and fun business. I enjoyed a lot of the people that I got to know through it. I got to work with advertising and marketing agencies in the New York metropolitan area. There's a lot of fun to that, a lot of creativity. But I hadn't really thought about this idea of calling again, other than to say, here's an opportunity, need to get a job, and I'm a pretty outgoing person, so a career in sales would at least make some sense. My life changed significantly at the age of 25. I received a phone call from my mom, again, living in the New York metropolitan area. My mom called to tell me that my brother, who was a year and a half younger than I was, and then a senior at the University of North Carolina, had gotten into a lot of trouble with a group of 3 of his classmates. The trouble was so extensive that my brother and his 3 classmates all got arrested for property-related crimes in the Greensboro, North Carolina area. And the crimes were so extensive that my mom had called to tell me that he was actually in jail and that a trial was being set both for him and for his classmates. We got down to Greensboro as quickly as we could, visited my brother in jail. Again, he's about 23 at the time. And it was almost as if I had gotten sucked into a parallel universe, in this case, being exposed to the North Carolina correctional system. And to make a long story short, eventually my brother was convicted of the crimes for which he was arrested, along with his classmates. He was sentenced to over 20 years in prison, and immediately was sent to a maximum security prison in the far reaches of North Carolina, an actual prison farm called Caledonia, which sounds as ancient, which is as ancient as it sounds in many ways. Visiting him there was almost as if I was watching scenes of Cool Hand Luke and a very southern prison. Suffice it to say, he would spend the next 5.5 years. That's how long he ended up serving there, for the most part in maximum security prisons. And it was a time in my life in which I, A, came to despise government, and B, was one of the first times, not the first time, but was one of the first times where I'd come into contact with a force, a bureaucracy, in this case, the North Carolina Department of Corrections, that while there were people that were there who were very well-meaning, they really weren't able to do anything to help. I'm sure there were some people who said they wanted to help that never did, but suffice it to say, it was an ordeal of 5.5 years. And that ordeal was in part not only what we were going through on the outside, but of course, what my brother was going through. There were years where there was really no rhyme or reason to what was happening to my brother, why on a first-time offense he was being put in these terrible places. And so those questions about why this was happening, why it was happening to my brother, a complete lack of control over things you really desperately wanted to have control, was a set of experiences that I hope I'm beginning to accurately describe. But again, it was 5.5 years of my brother being in prison. And again, in ways that made no sense at the time, but I hope I'll make some sense of here shortly, exposed me to really the worst of government, in the sense that it wasn't fair. It seemed completely disconnected from individual stories, that the bureaucracy that was government seemed completely incapable of addressing my needs or our needs as a family. And again, just treated people very badly. Now, as it related to its impact on me, it led me to faith. And again, I know that there are people on this webinar who don't happen to be people of faith, and that's great. I'm just saying that what it did for me is that in putting me, I think, in a position where I had lost control, it made me wonder if anyone was in control. And for me, that led me to faith in Jesus Christ, and an understanding that things that sometimes don't make any sense at the time can make sense eventually. I learned that too through my brother. My brother, who was an extremely secular person at the time, very caught up on what was popular, and not particularly focused on schoolwork at the time. He became a Christian within 1 month of being in jail. And he became a Christian before I did. And when I had come after several visits to see him in prison, and because he was in maximum security prison, his friends were rapists and murderers. I mean, these were not jaywalkers. And I began to see, as I visited him in prison, that not only was his life changed, I mean, when he became a person of faith, he changed radically from who he was, what was important to him, almost even how he looked. And at the same time, when I met his friends who were in his Bible study groups in these various prisons, because he got moved around a lot, again, completely out of control, no understanding why this was happening. I could see that they were much different people. Not that I knew them before, but these were people that obviously had their lives radically changed by their faith. Now, as it pertains to calling, there are a couple turning points that I just wanted to call out here. And again, it didn't change what I was doing, but it was really my first step at thinking about, at looking at my own life differently. And so I just have some bullet pointed here, items here, turning points from those 5.5 years when my brother was in prison. One, changes in your life can sometimes have nothing to do with the decision that you have made. But that doesn't mean you're not meant to learn from it. There may be people on this webinar that have had a very difficult time in their life, and for reasons that had nothing to do with you. They were a decision made by somebody else, or maybe it was a natural disaster. Maybe it is this pandemic. I got a call over the weekend from a dear friend of mine from high school who told me that his dad passed away due to COVID-19, somebody who I grew up with. and that his mom is currently in the hospital fighting it. Nothing to do with my friend, but nonetheless, something that is impacting him deeply. And even though it has nothing to do with you, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not supposed to learn something from it. And so not to dismiss the fact that the things that can change the way we look at the world are not necessarily things that we decide on or have decided. The second, and this began to impact me directly as it pertains to my personal calling, is that government matters, but it has a hard time engaging people as individuals. In fact, there are people who are victims of disconnected policies. Now, again, when I came out of George Washington, I was very politically active. I got involved in I happened to be someone more on the center right. I got involved in Young Republicans. I supported a friend of mine who was a chief of staff for a congressperson. And when I went through this experience with my brother, I completely disconnected from that. I mean, to me, politics was irrelevant. The government was actually not necessarily something not to be trusted, but was something that, if it had any impact on our lives, was usually going to be negative. But that's not to say that there aren't good people working in government. It's just to say that I know what it's like to be mistreated by government. And I think because I know that, I know a lot of other people who have had similar experiences. And that's not to say that government is bad. Believe me, I'm the dean of a policy school now. I'm not saying government is bad. But I'm saying that as this school was founded by the late social scientist James Q. Wilson, he wrote a very important book called Bureaucracy, and talks about the fact that in these bureaucracies, people that even have the best of intentions are not able to respond to crises, challenges, problems, just because of the way bureaucracies are. And we can have bureaucracies in the private sector too. I'm not saying they're not there, but I just got a different appreciation of how government bureaucracies work. Next, nonprofits and volunteers can come along to fill the gap. I learned this firsthand. My brother, again, who was someone who came to faith very early on, was supported throughout his 5.5 years across different prisons and correctional facilities by people in prison ministry, a group called Prison Fellowship, which is an incredible nonprofit that is working on policy and is supporting people inside government systems. It just gave me a whole new appreciation. And this will lead to some of the things I'll talk about shortly. That is, if you want to affect policy and politics, if you want to support people who have been disconnected by government systems, it doesn't only have to happen inside politics. It can happen from the outside with these nonprofit organizations. And it doesn't have to necessarily happen by making a career decision to go work for those places full time. But there were dozens of volunteers over the 5.5 years that had such a positive impact on my brother and supported us as a family who are outside that system. Next, in times of tragedy and suffering with others can be a way toward maturity. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we continue. But I did see through my brother's experience that those who engaged most directly in trying to learn the story and trying to help were the ones that suffered, but in the true understanding of compassion were the ones that also matured the most out of that experience. That's certainly true for me, but I also know that it was true of other family members. And then finally, personal growth can only come by sharing with others and ask them to suffer with you. And again, I'll reference this shortly, but I didn't tell anybody about what I was going through with my brother for at least the first 3 years of his being in prison. I was embarrassed by it. I didn't want to embarrass my brother. Really, for the first 3 years of visiting him In prison, I would just say, I'm going to visit my brother in North Carolina, and that was it. And what that disallowed was the opportunity for others to support me in what was a very, very difficult time. If I may be so bold to wonder if there are those in this webinar that have gone through something that you don't want to share. It's a crisis that you've been through that you're either embarrassed by, or you don't want to embarrass somebody else. I would just say that I learned firsthand that that's not sustainable. It comes out eventually, but you're also robbing others, your friends, family, and loved ones, from supporting you through what is a very difficult time. So that was that experience. And again, as I said, while it changed my faith perspective, it didn't change at all what I was doing professionally. I was still in the printing business, marketing and advertising. I was still working in the New York metropolitan area, still working with advertising and marketing agencies, still a very comfortable life. That changed on September 11th, 2001. I was working in Manhattan for a digital marketing agency called Corporate Voice. And the job that I had was in sales for them and working with Fortune 500 companies and their ad agencies in providing something at the time was still fairly new, which was websites, web development, web design, and digital marketing campaigns. Was having a lot of fun. I love New York. I still do. And I love working in the advertising business. But on September 11th, we all know what happened. I was in the offices of this agency that were located at 38th Street and 8th Avenue, about a 3-block walk from Penn Station in lower Midtown Manhattan, when a phone call came into the office from one of the staff who lived within blocks of Ground Zero, calling in to say that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers and that he was going to be late. Well, of course, we all thought, I thought at the time, that that was just a Cessna, that there was a small private plane that hit the immense World Trade Center, one of the towers, and that he would be in eventually. And I'm sure it was going to be a big news item that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers. But that was going to be about it. Obviously, we know what happened. Within about an hour and a half, as we began to understand in the office the scope and scale of what was happening, the president of our small agency sent everybody out. I can't say he sent us home, because I was commuting in from a commuter city in New Jersey, a commuter town, by train, and all the bridges and tunnels had been shut down. And so we were all sent out of the office. And as I stepped out and began walking around, not knowing exactly where I was going, I remembered that a good friend of mine who lived in Manhattan and was an attorney for the city of New York in the DA's office was working in the Staten Island office and had an apartment, though, up in the Upper East Side, up at 89th Street. I'm just remembering this, 89th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. And so I got through to him because he couldn't leave Staten Island. His name's Alan. I said, Alan, I've got nowhere to go. Is it possible for me to crash at your apartment? He said, of course. I'll just let the front desk know that you're coming, and you should feel free to stay there for as long as you need. And so I made the walk from 38th Street and 8th Avenue to 89th Street between 2nd and 3rd. And I don't know if I can adequately describe what that walk was like. But it was the beginning of a life-changing walk for me. I finally got to Alan's apartment, turned on the news, and just watched, as we all did, who were alive at the time. We may have some youngins here on this webinar who were not alive at the time, but just did not speak for 3 hours, staring at a television. not believing what I was seeing. I could only take as much of that as I could and walked out of the apartment and walked over to Central Park, which is only about a 3-block walk away, and I just started walking around. And as many of you who were either in New York or remember that time know, it was just a perfect late summer day and crystal clear, 75 to 80 degrees or so. And if you looked uptown, it looked like a perfectly normal day. If you looked downtown, all you saw was the brownish black smoke coming out of Ground Zero. I would learn later that a dear family friend had died in that tragedy. And I had a number of other friends who escaped near death. I did have someone I knew from the church I was attending at the time was also killed. And I was basically transported to another world of thinking. I don't know quite how to describe this, but I remember thinking at the time that the world around me was changing, and I had no idea how, but I knew that it was changing. I knew that after this, the world was going to change. And at the same time, I began to realize that looking out at what I hoped, I was 36 years old at the time, looking out at what I hoped was going to be another 30 years of a career, that I just couldn't see myself doing what I had been doing for the next 3 decades. And I don't know what triggered that. I just knew that as I perceived this world around me changing, that working in advertising and marketing was just not going to cut it anymore. Now, that's not to say that I don't know people that are in advertising and marketing to this day, lots of friends, and they love what they do, and they could very well be called to do what they do. There are people who are called to lives in advertising and marketing. I just know for me that for the first time in my life, I took a step out of my career and looked at it and said, I just don't see me doing this for 30 years. Now, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know, well, I'm going to do this then. It was just the beginning. And it happened on that day in the middle of Central Park, staring at the smoke coming out of Ground Zero, just realizing, I think I'm meant to do something else. Now, I want to pull up, I'm going to be referencing a couple books and in this presentation. And again, I'm going to be sending you along the links of these books, to these books, which I encourage your reading when you have time, but maybe we all have time these days. The first one is from a book called Range by David Epstein. And I'm going to cite this book a couple more times in this discussion, but suffice it to say that Range looks at people who have had radical career changes and looks at the reasons why people went from one career to another. And one of the concepts that David Epstein, the writer, outlines is that it's often in a time of crisis where people begin to ask these questions. And one of the examples he gives is Sebastian Junger. Some of you know him as an author and writer. Has written several books that have been turned into movies. But what you might not know is before he was an author, he was an arborist. And he was up in a tree at one point in his 20s, and he almost cut his leg off with a chainsaw that he was using to prune some trees. And in the hospital, he began to have this idea that he wanted to write a book about people who have dangerous jobs. And that led to a series of books that he's now written and a complete career change. And so I wanted to pull out this quotation, which I thought was appropriate. quote, "That cut was the best thing that ever could have happened to me. It gave me this template for seeing my career. Virtually every good thing in my life I can trace back to a misfortune. So my feeling is you don't know what's good and what's bad when things happen." And these are his italics or emphasis. You do not know. You have to wait to find out. And I think that's a pretty profound idea, because especially in times of crisis, the natural response for all of us is to say, why is this happening to me? And this is usually a rhetorical question because you know it shouldn't be happening to you. And this question is either addressed to God or some other force or to friends or family. And the point that Junger makes, as someone who's had his life radically transformed from a professional perspective, is that it took a crisis to take him out of what he was doing and to focus on who he was and what he was going to be doing with the rest of his life, now that he understood how fleeting life can be. So all this happens on 9/11, and I begin thinking about what I'm doing with my life. Within 2 weeks of 9/11, I was laid off from my job at Corporate Voice. I walked into the office, given a plastic bag, and told to fill up everything that I could that I wanted to take home from the office, and was asked to leave. And that walk from that office on 38th and 8th to Penn Station with a plastic bag holding all my belongings is something I'll never forget. You know, the agency itself closed down soon after that. And the economic impact throughout the marketing and advertising, especially the web business, was put into recession, especially in New York in the months following. So in a sense, I understood why that decision had to be made. But while I was beginning to question why or what I was going to do with the next 30 years of my career, I was forced to really think about it after I got laid off. But again, all to show that sometimes the things that can impact your life or impact your career are not necessarily your decision or your fault. They happen. Outside events can indeed impact your own life, and you have nothing to do with it. All that is for you to do is respond. And so in the months following 9/11 and after being let go, I really began to speak with some friends, people I knew who had an understanding of faith and an understanding of calling. And I was presented with a book by a Christian intellectual named Os Guinness called The Call. And I read that along with a number of other books that propose this concept of calling or vocation, which is to say, a way of thinking about your career or what you're doing professionally that is not just connected to putting food on the table, but is a way of thinking about it through the lens of who you are as a person and how best you can take who you are as a person and apply it to your professional decisions. Now, again, I understand that not everybody gets this opportunity. I hope this isn't seen as an indulgence, though, either. I know that there are people, most of the people in this world have to work at jobs that they have to work at, and they're thankful to have those jobs, and they don't take a lot of time to think about their calling. But if you've been given an opportunity to think about it, you should do it. I was given that opportunity, and I'm so glad that I did it. In some ways, I'm kind of bummed out that it took me to age 36 to ask these questions. But I've learned a lot. And now seeing the impact of this pandemic, I'm beginning to see that others are thinking about the decisions that they're making as well. It's also not to say that this concept of calling is purely a Christian one. There certainly is a history of Christian thought around the idea of calling or vocation. The word vocation is actually Latin for the word or for the phrase to be called. So in many ways, they're very similar understandings. But I want to pull up again a couple of these concepts here, and this book, and a quote from this book, The Call. So this is the book, The Call, and very early on, Os Guinness defines what he means by calling. As you see there, calling is the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, and everything we have is invested with a special devotion and dynamism lived out as a response to his summons and service. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking to make a career change, but it does mean that if you have the opportunity, we should be considering what we're doing, both in a career, but also outside of it, through this kind of lens. Now, calling presupposes that there is somebody calling you, but that doesn't have to be the only way that we understand that. Because as I said, there's been a long history of secular writers and thinkers on the subject of calling as well. I thought one of the very good ways of understanding calling in a secular way is through the ancient idea, both Greek and Roman philosophers have of the idea of happiness. Now, we think of happiness as something joyful, but the original understanding of happiness, certainly the one that's incorporated into the Declaration of Independence with the pursuit of happiness, is one that we are living. Happiness is the opportunity to live in accordance with our nature, with who we are. Robert Louis Wilkin is an ancient historian, writes quite a bit about the early Christian church, and he's at the University of Virginia. And I just drew out this quotation of his definition of calling or happiness. For the ancients, happiness was a possession of the soul, something that one acquired and that once acquired could not easily be taken away. Happiness designated the supreme end of human life. In the language of ancient philosophy, living in accord with nature, in harmony with our deepest aspirations as human beings. So not only in the Christian sense, but in the secular sense, there's an understanding that we've all been made for something. And I think what's important about what Guinness writes in The Call is that he defines that there is a primary and secondary calling, that there is a primary calling to each of us, he would say in the Christian sense, that we are being called into relationship with God. That is something that is sent to everyone. We all have a primary calling. But the secondary calling is being called to a second stage of doing something specific in response to our gifts, talents, and abilities. And so what that did for me is within a couple years of 9/11, I applied to graduate school. I applied to several of them, ended up coming out here to a school that prior to 9/11, I didn't even know existed, Pepperdine University, and specifically the Graduate School of Public Policy. Had 2 life-changing years here, went on to run a nonprofit, first time I'd ever done that, called Common Sense California. Came back to lead an institute here called the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement. Ended up living in California, something I never thought I'd be doing. Even when I started the program here, I never thought that I would be living here afterwards. Got involved in policy and politics, ran for office in 2014, something I didn't know would happen. And after running and losing that race, I came back to Pepperdine and have been the dean here, the very grateful dean of this very special graduate policy program for the last 4 years. Now, at each stage of those last 15 years now for me, almost 16 years, I've made a series of decisions, and I can't just say I have to say with my wife, Gina, who in many ways has only made making these decisions possible, that on the outside don't make a lot of sense outside of thinking about them through the lens of calling. And by that not making sense, I mean that financially, making decisions to turn down job opportunities, to accept job opportunities, don't make a lot of sense in kind of the purely secular way of understanding work or jobs or the financial implications. But I have to say, it has been such a fulfilling life. I'm sure if my wife is on this webinar, she's saying it's been a very hard life, and there have been those moments. But nonetheless, it has meant being truer to myself. And I'm just so grateful that I now have this new pair of glasses through which to look at not only the decisions that I have made, but the decisions I'm going to make. God willing, I've still got another 20 years of a career ahead of me. And so I will continue to use these glasses to look at decisions that I'll make. So I wanted to conclude with just a couple other learnings that I've had about calling, and then conclude with this discussion around the calling to public service. First, calling is discovered by listing your skills and passions. It's very important to have a sense of what you're good at, what you love. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will always do what you're good at, but that should at least be an indicator of things that you're being called to do. And you can find those things out by just doing a personal inventory. We've got so many survey tools out there, professional development tools out there that can give people a sense. I've taken at least a half a dozen of them that give you some sort of sense of what you're good at, what you like. But I think what's so interesting about that whole world of skills surveys is that they usually just tell you what you already know about you. At least that's what I found for me. I don't read any results of a survey I've taken about my own skills or professional career opportunities and think, wow, I never thought about that. But I think often we need to have a third person speak into our lives to tell us things we already know. And that only means that sometimes you should take seriously what you already know about yourself, things that you are good at and things that you care about, and know that you are good at them. Because that's why I think another reason why we take these surveys is we don't think sometimes that we're good enough. Secondly, calling is also comprised of experiences, both good and bad. And so very important, not only about your skills and abilities, but to think back on your life and the experiences that you've had. Maybe they're great experiences. Maybe you've had a great family upbringing. You've been given a lot of security out of that to take risky decisions. But maybe it's a difficult family experience. Maybe you went through something where you lost a family member. Maybe you were harmed in some way that led you not to trust your image of yourself or to trust others. But you've had that experience. And so the second bullet point really goes to the third, which is to say that an understanding of calling can mean seeing your life through that lens, which can redeem past tragedies. You know, I believe that in many ways that we either own our history or our history owns us. And in that, calling is an amazing way to take what have been very difficult experiences in your own life and transform them into learning experiences that you can then present to the world around you. Now, for me, I have a unique experience working in the field of public policy now with how people can be mistreated by government. And I would have only learned that through the very painful experience that I've had I understand why people sometimes say that government is important when it works, because I know there are a lot of people that need government to work for them and not against them. And I know people for whom government has worked against. And so, seen more broadly, taking those very difficult experiences and not losing them, getting something out of them that might transform what you're doing today, whether professionally or in your civic life. Next, calling is best uncovered by prayer or meditation and in community. Prayer, calling is essentially a communal exercise. It's important that you're asking those who you trust what they think you are good at, what they think you were made for. You do need those outside voices who love you and care about you, and I hope you have those people. It could be a teacher, it may not even be a family member. It could be somebody else in your life. It could be a husband or wife. In my case, it was my wife, as well as others who gave me the permission to think about a radical career change that was based on a sense of calling. But it is a communal exercise. You've got to be able to open yourself up if you're asking these questions about who you are and what you're meant to do. That has to be done with others. And then related to that, calling asks us to speak into the lives of others. You should never underestimate the power of your words in speaking into those who you love, friends and family, and especially those kinds of conversations that begin with, I see that you are really good at this. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, again, that they have to do that for a career, but you shouldn't withhold that because that can be a real gift to somebody else in your inner circle. The power of your words to those who you love, to see something good in them, even if it's something better than you, which can be hard, but is powerful and is a mature perspective to take with our friends and family, those who we love, to speak into their lives and to tell them how good they are at something specific, and to don't underestimate that they don't see that in themselves. Next, career decisions based on a sense of calling may not look rational to others. And as much as I've just said that it is a communal experience, that getting a sense of calling is something that you need to understand from others, there's a very good chance that if you make decisions based on calling, it will look strange to other people. And you just need to be ready for that, you know. If you've taken these other steps, then you will obviously know that if you make a decision that isn't the highest paying job, or it takes you away from where you've always lived, or takes you into a career that you believe you're going to be starting 15 years behind everybody else. Hello, that was me. That's not going to look rational, but that is a part of calling, and something you should at least be aware of. Next, calling can put the quest for success and wealth into important perspective. Now, again, there are people called into careers in which they're going to make millions, if not billions of dollars. We certainly see that in the sports world, but we also see that in the business world. I know people in business that are just really good at making money. They've got a skill that in this capitalist system is something very valuable. And they're not just doing it to make money, they're doing it because they're really good at it. And they feel a sense of calling into that. Now, that comes with a certain set of responsibilities about what you do with that money. But it's nonetheless possible that for those who are being called into careers that pay a lot of money, but also those that don't, that it is an important perspective to have. That I know the decisions that I made, especially early on in this career, meant walking away from a lot of money. And I was only able to do that because I had a wife who was able to walk away from a lot of money. And also at the same time realized that this is what we were being called to do. I remember when I came out of my graduate degree here with my master's degree, and I was presented with a great paying job back in my old life, back in marketing and advertising. And at the same time, I was presented with a job working for a nonprofit, not making a lot of money in the policy world. And it really meant, once again, as the set of decisions I had to go through in leaving a career and going back to school, it was a hard set of discussions and a decision to make. But if you have that sense of calling, it will facilitate those kinds of decisions. Next, calling may not mean a career change, but it should at least direct your civic engagement. In other words, your volunteering and your philanthropy. You know, again, you may not be able to leave a career for a variety of very good reasons. But in the very least, you should be thinking about calling as it relates to the things that you're doing outside of your so-called 9-to-5 job. And it should influence that. It certainly did for me. I mean, even before I went back to graduate school, I got very involved in prison fellowship as a volunteer for years, both at the time when my brother was in prison, but even afterwards, and still contribute and support financially prison fellowship, all because of those experiences that I had and the benefits that we reaped as a family from that great organization. Next, calling not only benefits you, it benefits society. And this is the interesting paradox about calling, is that it can be seen as very selfish, that you're looking inward, that you're saying, what am I good at? And what should I be doing? But really a society of people who are following their calling are ultimately benefiting society. People who are doing what they're called to do are not only seeing their life through a very particular lens, but they're making a very particular commitment to what they're doing. That whether you're a stockbroker or a school teacher or a stay-at-home mom, that you are benefiting all of those around you because you are making very intentional decisions. I have to say, when I made that career break, in some ways it was taking off my shoulders a burden that I didn't know initially existed, which was until 9/11, never having to ask, am I going to do this for the next 30 years of my career? Whether I asked that question before 9/11 or not, it was always there. And I didn't really, frankly, understand that until I was forced to ask and answer that question. And a society of those kinds of people is a society that flourishes. And then finally, it may mean shifting from long-term decision-making to short-term. And I want to go back to this book, Range, because Epstein, again, looks at those people who have made these changes in their careers, going from one place to a completely different career. And one of the things he's found in those people is that when they were considering a career change, they didn't necessarily come to a place where they said, okay, I'm done with chopping down trees, I'm going to write books. They usually went through a transitionary period that involved some sort of experimentation with that next step. Maybe it was going back to school. Maybe it was writing an article for a magazine before thinking about writing a book. Maybe it was making meals for friends before thinking you're going to go to culinary school. But there were some short-term steps that were taken by each of these people. And I have this quotation here, which you see. The protagonists had begun to feel unfulfilled by their work. And then a chance encounter with some world previously invisible to them led to a series of short-term explorations. At first, all career changers feel prey to the cult of the head start. Now, this is such a great term. And it's described elsewhere in the book, but the cult of the head start is you're somebody like me in your mid-30s and you say, I can't take a step out here because I'm going to be getting to the back of the line between all those 20-somethings. And believe me, I was in classes with all 20-somethings. And there were moments there where I felt extremely old and extremely out of it and not knowing where this career was going to go on the other side of this degree. But Epstein cites in many of these personal examples, I mean that by personal biographies of other people, that they had to get over this cult of the Head Start, and figured it couldn't possibly make sense to dispense with their long-term plans. But the more they dabbled, the more certain they were that it was time for a change. So these are the places where, these are the ways, the things that I've learned about calling, and the importance of it, not only to redeem past experiences, but also to be truer to who you are. Now, that's not to say, again, I feel myself saying not to say a lot in this webinar, that you're not already doing that. I'm sure that some of you are already doing that. And maybe this webinar is only serving as a confirmation of what you're already doing. I hope it is. But it does mean stepping out of what you're doing to at least examine what you're doing and why you're doing it, and try to hold it up to a different lens, to think differently about what you're doing, again, whether directly in your career or in your civic life. Now, I want to close. I see we're here going to run a little bit late, and I see most of you are hanging on. I wanted to talk about this last concept of calling, which is to public service. And this is my last slide. It is an important, thin little book by writer Andy Crouch, wrote a book, The Strong and the Weak. And it's not actually a book about calling, but it describes so well what a calling to public service would look like. Now, again, for me, my love of politics and policy began back in my undergraduate years. I then went through a period in my 20s when I hated it. I hated even the thought of government. And slowly but surely, I began thinking again about what I loved. And certainly 9/11 really triggered that. And what it meant for me in dabbling was that we had a politician running for governor, a man by the name of Brett Schundler, was running for governor of New Jersey, somebody I've come to really respect given his life story, somebody who had been in the private sector as well, now that I think about it, and went into politics. And he happened to locate his campaign headquarters about 15 minutes from where my wife and I were living. And so I talked it over with my wife, and she said, well, why don't you just go down there and volunteer? And sure enough, I dabbled. And I showed up and did anything that you did as a campaign volunteer, you know, licking envelopes and making phone calls on behalf of the candidate. And those 6 months or so of dabbling led me directly into thinking about going back to graduate school. Again, kind of in many ways reawakening some passions that had been dormant for over a decade, with the encouragement of my wife and prayer and thinking through this calling. Those were the steps that I took to eventually go back to graduate school at the ripe old age of 39 years old. A few years after that, I read this book, Strong and Weak. And the main concept in the book that Andy proposes is that we should conceive of our public engagement and our public policy making through what he calls this 2x2 matrix. And so across the x-axis, as you see there, is vulnerability. So on the right side of that is you're experiencing high vulnerability. And then on the y-axis is authority. And so on the high end of the y-axis, you're looking at being able to practice high levels of authority. And then below the x-axis, you're in a place where you have minimal agency, you would say, or authority. And so the 2x2 matrix creates 4 environments in what Andy calls 4 worlds in which people live. And so I'll actually start from segment quadrant 4 there, exploiting. So exploiting is where you have someone that's practicing high levels of authority and has very low levels of vulnerability. This is somebody who's a dictator. And a dictator isn't even a political position. They could be somebody that you work with, that it practices, it could be somebody that you live with. It could be somebody that you used to live with. These are people that have and practice high levels of authority, but have no vulnerability themselves. And they practice exploitative behavior. Down in quadrant 3 is withdrawing. And so Andy says these are people that really, they are the non-brother's keeper people, right? So they don't have much vulnerability. At the same time, they don't practice any authority. So even though they could engage, even though they could help, they don't. And Andy calls this the kind of the cruise ship mentality. You're on the cruise ship, you're not affecting where it's going. It's a pretty comfortable life, but you're not engaged in the world. The second quadrant is suffering, and that's where people are highly vulnerable, but have very low levels of authority. In some ways, it's the mirror image. These are the people who live in quadrant 4, right? Maybe you've been that person, but certainly in the public policy world, and again, I was exposed to many of them during my brother's time in prison. These are people oftentimes that are highly vulnerable, and they don't have the power to do anything about it. And what Andy's calling is for public leaders to create environments that look like the first quadrant, what he calls flourishing, in which you are practicing increasing levels of authority or power only as you're offering or make yourself vulnerable to critiques, support, whatever, from others. That the exercise of authority or power should only be held constant or governed, if you will, by increasing levels of vulnerability. And so this to me is the calling to public service, that whatever area you're working in, whether it's prison reform or the State Department, that you want to be creating environments where not only you, but the people who are in the public have the ability to flourish. And to be able to flourish is essentially the pursuit of happiness. That not only you should be the one that can make decisions in accordance with your calling, but other people can do that too. Understanding that many people who want to practice their calling may have lived a life of suffering. And so we have to fight that and to create a world that's flourishing. So with that, I will bring you back into this discussion and answer any questions that you might have. Again, I know that we've run a bit long here. I was thinking we might run till 45 past. And so at the same time, I certainly welcome any questions that you may have via email. And so following this session, again, we'll be sending you a link to this session, along with links to several of the books that I've cited here. And again, welcome any questions that you might have in response. Student fan, with instinct, I've done recent use. Yeah. So it's great to hear some of the feedback that's coming in about people thinking about their own careers. And I know from looking at the people who are on the matrix here that there are people that are already doing this. I simply, again, what triggered putting on this webinar in the first place is just what I was beginning to see in the world around me, especially with 20-somethings who were really beginning to question what the fall was going to look like. There may be people on this webinar who had a job all set up for the fall that's not there anymore. And that's a terrible thing. That's a hard thing. And I know what that feels like. I would just say that we should not lose this opportunity to ask these bigger questions about who we are. And again, it provides an opportunity not only to connect with others, but also to redeem, and I don't use that term loosely, to redeem past tragedies in your own life, because those might be the things that other people need to hear. Want to know, we could do with their broken politics today, but it doesn't seem to be much calling down politicians. Yeah. So, very good question about politics and where we're at. And there don't seem to be a lot of people talking about calling. This is, of course, true. But maybe that's another reason, not maybe, that is another reason for this webinar, right? I mean, maybe calling could be a different way that we see our politics. In other words, that the pursuit of happiness is a real thing, understood originally, right? That the founders believed that the country was meant to be, didn't realize it at the time, hasn't realized it today, but that our politics were meant to create an environment where people could pursue their own happiness. And again, that wasn't a happiness of joy, again, not classically understood. That's a happiness of being able to follow our own calling. And again, that doesn't just mean laissez-faire, let's take government out of the equation and we don't care about nonprofits, just let everybody do what they want to do. There are people that need help. There are people that are in places where, to go back to that 2x2 matrix, where they are suffering. They are suffering because they don't have the agency to overcome authority that is working against them. And wherever you are, on the left or right or in the middle, I think we should at least be able to agree that a society that provides opportunities for people to realize their own happiness really should be the goal of all public policy. Doesn't matter what it is. And so maybe there's an opportunity here in looking at our own calling, that for those of you who are considering careers in public service, that that wherever you go, whether it's into educational systems or federal agencies or local governments or nonprofits, that this becomes the way that you define what you're doing. That this becomes a way of defining success. I think that could only be a good thing. Time for a couple other questions. Government should be doing, yes, Anthony, right. So again, and I am a conservative. What my brother's prison experience taught me is that when I was in the midst of this turbulence of not being able to affect my brother's release, it wasn't that I realized that government was too big. The big small question of government wasn't the question. In some ways, I could almost wish that government would be bigger so that more people could respond to my particular needs. But the big small question wasn't the right question. I learned from that time that the question was, can government be just? And can a bureaucracy be shaped in such a way that it can engage with the rights and needs of individuals? And so I would say, as a conservative, and I've said for a long time, that the big small question of government is not as accurate and not as helpful as seeing, is government working, and is government at least playing a role in creating an environment of flourishing? And I could point to a lot of different ways in which government, frankly, because it's too big, is preventing environments of flourishing. But in some ways, it's too small. There are a lot of places where people need government to work better than it does. And that doesn't necessarily mean the government needs to be smaller, but it needs people to make it work better. And for people who decide for careers in public service, again, if you start with the goal of being an environment of flourishing, then everything else really should form around that. And the big government, small government debate doesn't really get you there. All right, one last question. Scroll, where do you feel we will enter fundamentally different? Yeah, so the question about the post-COVID-19 world, and that really takes us back to the beginning of this conversation. I think in ways in which the world changed, and especially American policy and politics changed after 9/11, the post-COVID world in our policy and politics will be significantly different. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. Will there be a new DHS that is working on pandemics? Maybe. Will we build buildings differently the way we did after 9/11 because of the pandemic? Maybe. Will travel be changed the way it was after 9/11? Absolutely it will. And that's the policy part. On the politics part, I hope that what our post-COVID-19 political world looks like is one in which we are understanding who we are as a nation, that this pursuit of happiness can be seen as a human, global, a universal ideal, but it's also a uniquely American one that we actually prioritized it so much that we put it into one of our founding documents, that we said this was a goal, that we said the pursuit of happiness was a goal. This wasn't in a UN charter. This was in the Declaration of Independence. And so I hope that there's a new appreciation, and as much as there will be turbulence, that there are founding principles that need to be adhered to and maybe reimagined, but still we are reimagining only what came before us. That certainly is what we teach here at the Policy School. And I hope our politics going forward can reimagine that pursuit of happiness once again. Well, again, I want to thank you all for joining me. So many friends that I see here on the screen, and people who I don't know, but I look forward to being in touch with you. Again, we'll be following up with all who registered. I believe we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 or 130 people registered for this webinar, and follow up not only with the link to the video, but also the books that I've mentioned. So thank you for joining me here at Pepperdine, hearing my story, but also hopefully getting a clearer understanding of what calling and vocation mean. God bless you all, and stay safe.